An evil doctor refuses to treat a black woman, ignoring her pleas for medical attention. 5 minutes later, karma hits him hard when he is faced with the true consequences of his racist acts. How could one decision destroy his life forever? What secret is the woman hiding that could change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dr. Phil Barnes strode through the sliding glass doors of Metro General Hospital, his polished leather shoes clicking against the freshly waxed floor. This was his domain, where he'd built his reputation over 15 years of dedicated service. "Good morning, Dr. Barnes," Sarah, the receptionist, called out with her usual cheerful smile. He gave her a practiced nod and a small wave, maintaining the professional distance he preferred. "Morning, Sarah. Any messages?" His voice carried the confidence of someone who knew their place in the world. "Nothing urgent, doctor. Your first appointment isn't for another hour." Phil made his way toward the elevator, his white coat crisp and pristine. 2 nurses stepped aside as he approached, their respectful smiles acknowledging his status. The 5th floor, his floor, welcomed him with the usual morning bustle. Medical charts were being updated, nurses were changing shifts, and the smell of coffee wafted from the break room. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Dr. Barnes," Dr. Rodriguez, a young resident, hurried to catch up with him. "That procedure you performed yesterday? Absolutely brilliant. I was hoping we could discuss your technique." Phil allowed himself a small smile. "Of course, stop by my office later." He enjoyed mentoring the younger doctors, especially the ones who recognized his expertise. Inside his office, Phil settled into his leather chair, taking a moment to survey his wall of achievements. Medical school diploma, board certifications, and various awards, each frame reflecting years of dedication and success. He was halfway through his coffee when the hospital intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't calling his name, just routine announcements. Phil began reviewing his patient files for the day when a different sound caught his attention, raised voices and the shuffling of many feet from somewhere down below. Curious, he walked to his window overlooking the main lobby. A crowd was forming, growing larger by the second. Medical staff and visitors alike were gathering around someone, on the floor. From his vantage point, he could make out a woman lying still on the white tiles. Phil moved away from the window, his curiosity piqued. Whatever was happening down there, it was causing quite a disruption to his normally orderly hospital. He stepped out of his office, heading toward the elevator. The commotion was growing louder, and he felt drawn to investigate the source of this unexpected chaos in his otherwise perfectly controlled morning. Phil made his way through the gathered crowd. "Excuse me, let me through," he said, his authoritative voice causing people to part automatically, like waves before a ship's bow. On the floor lay a black woman in her mid-30s, her face contorted in pain as she clutched her right side. Her blue dress was stained with what looked like coffee, and her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that echoed in the suddenly quiet space. A broken heel lay a few feet away, explaining her fall. Her purse had spilled open, scattering papers and personal items across the polished floor. "Please," she called out, her eyes locking onto Phil's white coat with desperate hope. "Doctor, help me. I can't breathe properly." Her voice was strained but clear, carrying a dignity despite her obvious distress. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead as she struggled to maintain composure. Phil felt his muscles tense involuntarily. His hands grew clammy inside his coat pockets, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Doctor," the woman pleaded again. "I'm Martha Young. Something's not right. Please." She tried to shift position, wincing at the movement. Phil's throat felt dry as sandpaper. He glanced around, hoping to spot another physician, but he was the only doctor present. The crowd watched expectantly, their eyes boring into him, waiting for him to take charge of the situation. The weight of their stares pressed down on his shoulders. "Nurse," he called out, his voice slightly hoarse. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time, fighting to maintain his professional demeanor. "Nurse Mitchell." A young nurse in blue scrubs pushed through the crowd, her shoes squeaking against the floor. "Yes, Dr. Barnes." Get a wheelchair. We need to move her to the ER. His words came out clipped and professional, but his body remained rigid, maintaining distance from Martha, as if an invisible barrier separated them. As the nurse hurried away, Phil stood back, watching as two orderlies helped keep the murmuring crowd at bay. Martha's eyes remained fixed on him, filled with pain and something else. Understanding. Compassion. He couldn't quite meet her gaze, instead focusing on a spot just above her head. The nurse returned quickly with a wheelchair, its metal frame gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Phil watched as they carefully helped Martha into it, his feet feeling like lead weights. When they began moving toward the ER, he followed behind, maintaining several steps of distance. Each step felt forced, mechanical, his discomfort visible in his stiff shoulders and clenched jaw. The emergency room doors swung open as the nurse wheeled Martha in, with Phil following at a distance. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Martha's pain-stricken face as she gripped the wheelchair's armrests. "Doctor, please do something!" Martha gasped, her voice trembling. "The pain is getting worse." Nurse Mitchell quickly checked Martha's vitals, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. Her face grew more concerned with each reading. "Dr. Barnes, her blood pressure is dangerously high, and her pulse is racing. We need to examine her right away." She reached for the blood pressure cuff again, double-checking the numbers. Phil stood near the doorway, his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, shoulders rigid with tension. The sterile smell of the emergency room seemed suffocating as he watched the nurse help Martha onto the examination bed. His feet felt rooted to the floor, unwilling to move closer, while Martha's soft whimpers of pain filled the room. "Doctor?" the nurse prompted again, concern evident in her voice. She glanced between Phil and her patient with growing anxiety. "She needs immediate attention." Phil's jaw clenched as he took a half-step backward, his white coat rustling with the movement. He beckoned the nurse over with a slight motion of his head, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried in the quiet room. "Find Dr. Peterson or Dr. Rodriguez, I'm leaving." Martha's eyes widened as she caught his words, pain and disbelief mixing on her features. "Please, doctor, don't go. I need help now." Her hand reached out toward him pleadingly. Phil turned toward her, his face hardening into a mask of cold disdain, lips pressed into a thin line. "You should be grateful I even allowed you into this emergency room. Your kind can wait for another doctor." The words came out sharp and cutting. As he spun on his heel and strode toward the door, his steps faltered. There, filling the doorframe with his imposing presence, stood Dr. Anthony Hopkins, the hospital's chief of medicine. His arms were crossed over his chest and his expression was as dark as a gathering storm. Phil's face drained of color as he met his superior's stern gaze, and he unconsciously took a step back. Phil straightened his coat and forced a smile onto his face, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. A cold sweat had already begun to form at the back of his neck. "Dr. Hopkins, I was just... Save it." Anthony's voice cut through the air like steel. His dark eyes never left Phil's face as he stepped fully into the room, his shoulders squared and tension visible in his jaw. "I heard every word you just said to that patient." Phil's smile faltered, his lips twitching nervously. "Sir, I can explain. I was simply suggesting that another doctor might be better suited to..." "Better suited?" Anthony's voice remained level, but there was no mistaking the anger beneath his controlled tone. His fingers drummed once against his clipboard before going still. "Let me be absolutely clear, Dr. Barnes. In this hospital, we treat every patient with dignity and respect regardless of their race, religion, or background. What I just witnessed was a direct violation of everything we stand for." Sweat beaded on Phil's forehead as he scrambled to recover, his white coat suddenly feeling too tight around his shoulders. "I apologize if my words came across poorly. Perhaps I was just tired and..." "That's not an apology, that's an excuse." Anthony uncrossed his arms and stood straighter, his presence seeming to fill the entire doorway. "And it's not the first complaint I've received about your behavior toward minority patients. I've been watching hoping you'd prove those reports wrong. Instead, you've confirmed them." Phil's face paled further, the color draining from his cheeks like water down a drain. "Dr. Hopkins, please. You're fired, effective immediately. Turn in your badge at security on your way out." Anthony's tone left no room for argument, each word falling like a hammer blow. "We have no place for discrimination in this hospital." "But my career, my reputation." Phil sputtered, reaching out desperately, his hand shaking in the air between them. Anthony simply turned away from Phil and walked to Martha's bedside, his demeanor softening as he addressed her. The change in his expression was immediate, from steel to genuine concern. Without another glance at Phil, he closed the door firmly behind him, leaving his former employee standing alone in the hallway, the echo of the closing door like a final period on his career. Phil stood frozen outside the emergency room, his world crumbling around him. 20 years of medical practice, his prestigious position, his carefully built reputation, all gone in an instant. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white with rage, while his stomach churned with a sickening mix of disbelief and fury. "This is all her fault," he muttered through gritted teeth, tasting bitter bile in his mouth. His face burned with humiliation as passing nurses averted their eyes, pretending not to notice his distress. Some whispered behind raised hands, their hushed voices carrying just enough for him to know they were talking about him. The badge clipped to his white coat suddenly felt heavy, like a weight pulling him down into the depths of his shame. The automatic doors couldn't open fast enough as he burst into the parking lot, the cool evening air doing nothing to calm his racing thoughts or ease the thundering of his heart. Meanwhile, inside the emergency room, Dr. Anthony Hopkins gently adjusted Martha's IV line. His movements were precise and caring, a stark contrast to Phil's earlier coldness. The steady beeping of the heart monitor provided a reassuring backdrop to the quiet room. "Mrs. Young," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside her bed, the wheels squeaking slightly on the floor. "I want to personally apologize for Dr. Barnes's behavior. That kind of discrimination has no place in this hospital, or anywhere else. We pride ourselves on providing care to everyone who walks through these doors." Martha's eyes welled with tears, but she managed a weak smile, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared when he—" "You don't need to worry about him anymore," Anthony assured her, patting her hand with genuine warmth. "I'm going to oversee your care personally. We'll run some tests to check your heart." Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks as she gripped Anthony's hand, her dark skin contrasting with his lighter tone, in a way that highlighted the absurdity of Phil's prejudice. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was beginning to think nobody would help me." "That's what we're here for, Mrs. Young," Anthony replied, his warm smile reaching his eyes and crinkling the corners. "Every single patient deserves respect and proper care. Now let's focus on getting you better." Dr. Anthony then did some tests, leaving all his current commitments aside. "Well, Mrs. Young, I have some good news for you. After reviewing the results from your tests, it looks like the heart issue isn't as serious as we initially feared. It seems to be a case of acute stress cardiomyopathy, sometimes referred to as broken heart syndrome. It's typically brought on by extreme stress, but with rest and the right medication, you should make a full recovery." Martha let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, relief washing over her. She managed a small smile, though she still looked pale against the white hospital pillow. "So it's not something permanent?" Dr. Hopkins nodded, his expression gentle. "That's right. Your heart is structurally sound, and there's no lasting damage. What you're experiencing is likely a temporary weakening of the heart muscle, and it should resolve over time. We'll keep you on a mild beta blocker for a few weeks to help your heart function more evenly, but after a bit of rest, you should feel much better." Just then, Dr. Hopkins' assistant stepped in, as Dr. Hopkins began to leave the room. "The key is rest, Mrs. Young," she emphasized. "Tonight, we'd like to keep you in the hospital just for observation, to make sure the medication is working well and that your heart rhythm stays stable. If all goes well, we'll discharge you tomorrow morning, and you can continue your recovery at home." Martha nodded gratefully, glancing between the two doctors. Thank you, both of you. I was so scared. I thought it might be something that would change my life forever. As the doctors finished their explanations and prepared to leave, Nurse Mitchell lingered behind, her demeanor warm and attentive. She straightened the blanket on Martha's bed and checked the IV drip before leaning down slightly. Would you like me to call anyone for you? Sometimes it helps to have a loved one close by in situations like this, she offered kindly. Martha hesitated, a shadow passing over her face as she considered the offer. I have my mom, she said after a moment, a hint of a smile softening her tired features. But I don't want to worry her too much. She's been through a lot lately and she needs her rest too. It's already late and I don't want her rushing down here tonight. You can call her in the morning, once everything is settled. Nurse Mitchell's expression grew more serious. I understand, Mrs. Young, but I do think it might be best to let her know now, just so she's aware of what's happened. Even if you feel it's better for her to come in the morning, it might give her peace of mind to hear your voice. What do you say? Martha sighed softly, recognizing the wisdom in the nurse's words. She took a moment to gather herself, then nodded. You're right. I'll talk to her now, but I'll make sure she knows there's no need to hurry over tonight. Nurse Mitchell nodded and quickly arranged for the phone to be brought to Martha's bedside. Within moments, the familiar ring echoed through the room, and Martha closed her eyes for a second, bracing herself. After a few rings, a voice crackled through the line, the voice of her mother, Lydia, thick with concern. Martha? Where have you been? Martha forced a reassuring smile into her voice, keeping her tone as light as possible. Mama, don't worry. I'm fine, really. I had a little scare with my heart, but the doctors here have checked everything. It's not as bad as we thought. They're just keeping me overnight to make sure everything's stable. I'll be out tomorrow morning and I'll be back home before you know it. Her mother's voice wavered slightly and Martha could hear her trying to hold back tears. Baby, you should have called me sooner. I'm coming right now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. No, Mama, please, Martha interjected gently but firmly. It's late, and you need your rest too. I'm in good hands here, and I'm really okay. I promise. Just come in the morning, and we'll go home together then. There's no need for you to drive in the dark and worry yourself over this. Lydia hesitated on the other end, clearly torn between her instinct to be by her daughter's side and Martha's insistence that she wait. Finally, she relented with a soft sigh. All right, but you call me if anything changes, okay? And I'll be there first thing in the morning. Don't try to do anything on your own, you hear? Martha's smile softened, a hint of the deep bond she shared with her mother shining through. I hear you, Mama. I'll see you in the morning. I love you. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital room window, casting a warm glow across Martha's bed. The steady beeping of monitors filled the quiet space as she lay there, still groggy from the surgery but feeling infinitely better than she had the day before. The door creaked open and Lydia, her mother, rushed in, her face etched with concern and relief, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. Oh, baby, she breathed, hurrying to Martha's bedside, her shoes clicking rapidly across the linoleum floor. Her warm hands enveloped Martha's, squeezing gently, transmitting all the love and worry she felt. I've been worried sick since you told me. I'm glad you're fine. Mama, Martha whispered, her voice scratchy from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier, managing a weak smile despite her discomfort. I'm okay now. The doctors fixed everything. You don't need to worry anymore. Lydia's eyes glistened with tears as she stroked Martha's forehead, just like she used to do when Martha was a little girl with a fever. The familiar gesture brought comfort to them both. Thank God you're all right. When I think about what could have happened if you hadn't gotten help in time. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together, trying to compose herself, her hand trembling slightly against Martha's skin. Don't cry, Mama, Martha said softly, squeezing her mother's hand. I'm still here. We'll have plenty more time together. Lydia pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes, sniffling quietly. You're right, baby. You're right. A knock at the door drew their attention, and Dr. Anthony Hopkins stepped in, clipboard in hand, his white coat pristine and professional. His face brightened with a warm smile when he saw Martha awake and alert, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Young," he said, approaching the bed with confident steps, "it's wonderful to see you looking so much better. Your color has really improved since yesterday, and you must be her mother?" He extended his hand to Lydia, who shook it gratefully, appreciating his kind demeanor. "Dr. Hopkins," Martha said, her eyes welling up with tears of gratitude, "I can't thank you enough for yesterday. The way you stepped in when Dr. Barnes—" She trailed off, the memory still painful, her free hand unconsciously moving to her chest. Anthony's expression turned serious, his shoulders squaring as he addressed the situation. "Mrs. Young, I want to apologize again for that incident. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and I'm deeply sorry you had to experience that kind of treatment in our hospital. We hold ourselves to higher standards than that." Martha shook her head, a tear rolling down her cheek and onto the hospital gown. "You saved my life, Dr. Hopkins. If you hadn't been there—" She squeezed her mother's hand tighter, drawing strength from the contact. "Thank you for helping me when I needed it most. I'll never forget what you did for me." Dr. Anthony reviewed Martha's charts one final time, nodding with satisfaction as he flipped through the pages of test results and nurses' notes. "Well, Mrs. Young, your vitals are stable, and I'm confident you can continue your recovery at home." He looked up from the clipboard, his expression serious but kind, crow's feet crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "However, I need to stress the importance of complete bed rest for the next few days. No work, no household chores, just rest. Your body needs time to heal properly." Lydia straightened in her chair beside Martha's bed, her face set with determination as she gripped her worn leather purse tightly. "Don't you worry, doctor. I'll make sure she follows every instruction to the letter." She patted Martha's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "She won't be lifting a finger until you say it's okay. I'll see to that myself." Martha smiled weakly at her mother's protective tone, recognizing the familiar stubborn set of her jaw. "Mama, I'll be fine." "That's exactly what you said before you ended up here," Lydia reminded her gently, her voice tinged with worry. "This time, we're doing things differently. No arguments." Dr. Anthony handed Martha a thick packet of papers, the pages crisp and official-looking. "Here are your discharge instructions and prescriptions. The medications will help manage any lingering pain and prevent complications. Remember to schedule a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. My office will call to check on you in a few days." After completing the discharge process and signing what felt like endless forms, Martha changed into the fresh clothes Lydia had brought from home, soft cotton pants and her favorite oversized sweater. Her mother's steady arm supported her as they made their way through the bustling hospital corridors and out to the parking lot. The afternoon sun felt warm on Martha's face as she carefully settled into the passenger seat of her mother's old Buick. Its familiar leather seats cracked but comfortable. The drive home was quiet, with Lydia occasionally glancing over at Martha, who watched the familiar streets pass by through the window, each landmark bringing her closer to the comfort of home. When they arrived at their modest single-story house with its small but well-tended garden, Lydia helped Martha inside and straight to her bedroom. "Let's get you comfortable," Lydia said softly, arranging the pillows just so and pulling back the worn but clean-quilted bedspread, the one her grandmother had made years ago. Martha sank gratefully into the familiar comfort of her own bed, feeling the weight of the past few days settling heavily on her shoulders like a physical burden. As Lydia tucked the covers around her daughter, she paused, her hand resting gently on Martha's arm, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Baby, about what happened at the hospital." She sighed deeply, lines of concern etching her face. "I wish I could say it was the last time you'll face something like that, but we both know better." Martha's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion as she listened to her mother's words, the familiar scent of lavender from her mother's hand cream wrapping around her. "I know, Mama," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "But there are good people too, like Dr. Hopkins." "That's right," Lydia agreed, smoothing Martha's hair back from her forehead with tender care. You just rest now. Everything else can wait." Martha's eyes drifted closed, the familiar sounds of home, the gentle whir of the ceiling fan, the distant ticking of the hallway clock, and her mother's loving presence wrapping around her like a warm blanket as she slipped into a peaceful sleep. After a few hours of peaceful sleep, Martha finally woke up later that afternoon. Reaching for the mobile phone on her nightstand, she squinted at the screen. The number wasn't familiar, but something in her gut made her answer anyway. "Hello?" Her voice was still thick with sleep, and she cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Young?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling, like a child afraid of punishment. This is Dr. Barnes. Phil Barnes." Martha's body tensed immediately, and she pushed herself up against her headboard, suddenly wide awake. Her heart began to race as memories of their last encounter flooded back. The harsh words, the hurt, the humiliation. "How did you get my number?" I looked it up in your hospital records," Phil admitted, his voice carrying a note of shame. "I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to talk to you. Please don't hang up. Just hear me out." Martha's fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. "What do you want?" "They fired me," Phil said, his voice cracking slightly. "Dr. Hopkins. He terminated my position immediately. 5 years at that hospital gone in an instant. And the worst part is, I deserve it. I know I do." Martha remained silent, listening to his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. She could almost picture him pacing, running his fingers through his hair in distress. "Mrs. Young, Martha, I need to speak with you in person, please. I know I have no right to ask, but I'm begging you. Just give me a chance to—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words, his voice thick with emotion. Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Her initial instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from any further hurt. But something in his voice, the raw desperation, the genuine pain, the hint of remorse, made her pause and reconsider. After what felt like an eternity, Martha took a deep breath, her hand absently smoothing the wrinkles in her bedsheet. "I'm on strict bed rest," she said firmly. "If you want to talk, you'll have to come here." "Here?" Phil's voice carried surprise and relief in equal measure, as if he'd been expecting an outright rejection. "Yes, to my house." Martha recited her address, speaking slowly to ensure he got it right, her heart thumping with uncertainty. "But Dr. Barnes?" "Yes?" "Don't make me regret this." "Thank you," Phil breathed, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't let you down. Not this time." The call ended, and Martha sat in her bed wondering if she'd made the right decision, or if she was opening herself up to more pain. The late afternoon light painted her room in warm amber tones as she contemplated the conversation that lay ahead, her mind racing with possibilities both hopeful and fearful. Phil stood in front of his hallway mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his collar, trying to look presentable despite the turmoil churning inside him. "Heading out to the hospital, dear?" his wife Jenny called from the kitchen. His stomach clenched at the lie he was about to tell. "Yes, just a few patients to check on," he replied, his voice carefully steady. The weight of his unemployment pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her. Not yet. Not until he figured out what he was going to do. "Don't forget we have dinner with the Hendersons tonight," Jenny reminded him. "I'll be back in plenty of time," Phil assured her, grabbing his car keys from the hook by the door. He paused briefly, guilt gnawing at him as he heard her humming in the kitchen, blissfully unaware of how their lives had changed. The drive took him into parts of town he rarely visited. As his luxury sedan cruised down unfamiliar streets, Phil noticed the gradual change in the neighborhood. The manicured lawns and sprawling houses of his suburb gave way to smaller homes with chain-link fences and children's toys scattered across tiny yards. He checked the address on his phone again, turning onto Martha Street. The houses here were modest, but most showed signs of careful maintenance. Fresh paint, neat gardens, clean windows. It was different from what he'd expected, challenging his preconceptions with each passing home. Martha's house was small but well kept, with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows and potted plants decorating the narrow front porch. Phil parked his car and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered his courage. The contrast between this neighborhood and his own gated community struck him forcefully, making him uncomfortably aware of his own privileges. Finally, he stepped out of his car and walked up the short concrete path to the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing an older woman who could only be Martha's mother. Lydia's expression was guarded, her eyes studying him with careful consideration. "Dr. Barnes," she said, her tone neutral but firm. "Martha's expecting you. Please, come in." Phil followed her into the modest home, noting the family photos on the walls and the smell of fresh flowers from a vase on a small side table. The house was immaculately clean, with worn but well-cared-for furniture. "This way," Lydia said, leading him down a short hallway to Martha's room. Her protective stance made it clear that while he was allowed in, he was very much on probation. Martha sat propped up against several pillows, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Phil entered the room. Her expression was a careful mix of wariness and curiosity, her eyes following his movements as he settled into the chair Lydia had placed beside the bed. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains cast a gentle glow across the room, highlighting the tension in both their faces. "Dr. Barnes," Martha said, her voice calm but direct, her fingers unconsciously tightening around each other. "Why did you want to meet me? What do you hope to accomplish here?" Phil shifted uncomfortably in the chair, its wooden frame creaking softly beneath him. His usual confidence was notably absent, replaced by an uncertainty that seemed foreign on his features. He stared at his hands for a long moment, his fingers fidgeting with his wedding ring, before lifting his gaze to meet hers briefly, then dropping it to the floor. "I lost my job," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "Dr. Hopkins fired me immediately after what happened at the hospital." He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "But that's not why I'm here. What I did, what I said to you, it wasn't just unprofessional. It was wrong. Deeply wrong." Martha remained silent, watching as Phil struggled to continue. His shoulders hunched forward, making him appear smaller than his tall frame, like a man carrying an invisible weight. The ticking of the bedside clock seemed to grow louder in the heavy silence between them. "There's something I've never really talked about," he said, his voice becoming unsteady, cracking at the edges. "My younger brother, Tommy, he was killed 15 years ago. The person who did it was..." His voice caught in his throat. "He was black. I was supposed to pick Tommy up that night, but I was running late. If I had been there..." Tears began to roll down Phil's cheeks as he continued, leaving wet trails that glistened in the afternoon light. "I let that hatred grow inside me. I blamed an entire race for what one person did to my brother. I've been carrying this poison around for so long, letting it affect how I treat people like you, poisoning everything I touch." Martha's expression softened as she watched this proud man break down before her, his pain raw and real. She felt an unexpected wave of sympathy wash over her, even as she processed the shocking revelation about his past. The room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate as the weight of his confession settled between them. Martha took a measured breath, her hand smoothing the soft cotton blanket across her lap. "Dr. Barnes, I appreciate your honesty, and I'm truly sorry about your brother. That kind of loss, it changes you. It leaves a hole that nothing else can quite fill." Her voice softened as she continued, "I understand loss too. My husband, James, was a soldier. He died serving our country 3 years ago." She paused, blinking back tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "Sometimes I still expect to see him walking through the door, still in his uniform, smiling that bright smile of his, the kind that could light up any room he walked into." Phil looked up, surprise flickering across his face as Martha went on, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "After he died, I had to figure out how to keep going. Now I work at a small NGO, helping families in need, The pay barely covers my bills, but the work, it gives me purpose. It helps me heal. Every day I see people finding hope again, and that means everything. Something shifted in Phil's expression as he listened, a shadow of understanding crossing his features. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. The scratch of his pen filled the quiet room as he wrote, the morning sunlight streaming through the window beside them. He tore the check free and held it out to Martha with slightly trembling fingers. "For your NGO," he said softly, his voice carrying a new warmth. "I hope it can help make a difference for the families you serve." Martha's eyes widened as she saw the amount, her breath catching in her throat. Before she could speak, Phil pulled a business card from his wallet and placed it on her bedside table, next to the half-empty water glass. "My personal number is on the back," he said, standing up and straightening his white coat. "If you ever need medical help, or anything really, please don't hesitate to call. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to do better. I need to do better." Martha watched as he walked toward the door, his steps measured and purposeful, her heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. Maybe, she thought, real change was possible after all. Sometimes the hardest walls came down one brick at a time. Over the next few days, Martha slowly recovered thanks to Lydia's constant care. As soon as she woke up, Lydia hovered nearby, concern etched on her face. "Are you sure you're ready to go back to work, honey?" Lydia asked, holding out Martha's favorite cardigan. "Nobody would blame you for taking another week." Martha smiled, accepting the soft blue sweater. "I'm sure, Mom. Being stuck in bed has given me too much time to think. I need to get back to work, back to helping people." "At least let me drive you," Lydia insisted, already reaching for her car keys. "Just for today." The drive to the NGO was quiet, with Martha watching familiar neighborhood scenes pass by her window. Small corner stores were just opening their doors, and children in backpacks waited at bus stops. This was her community, the place she'd chosen to serve. When they pulled up to the modest brick building that housed the NGO, Martha noticed more people than usual waiting outside. Some sat on the worn wooden bench near the entrance, while others leaned against the wall, faces drawn with worry. "That's strange," Martha murmured, checking her watch. "The clinic doesn't open for another hour." Inside, she found Sarah, the NGO's caretaker, looking frazzled as she sorted through a stack of medical files. The woman's gray hair was escaping from its usual neat bun, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Martha, thank goodness you're back," she exclaimed, dropping the files onto her desk. "We've got a situation." "What's wrong?" Martha asked, easing herself into a chair. "Dr. Rodriguez had to fly home to Puerto Rico yesterday. His mother had a stroke." Sarah ran a hand through her hair, further disheveling it. "He's our only doctor, and we've got at least 15 people waiting for medical care already." Martha glanced through the window at the growing crowd outside. She recognized Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who relied on the clinic for her blood pressure medication, and the Garcia family with their young son who needed his asthma checked. "We can't just turn them away," she continued, her voice tight with frustration. "Most of these folks can't afford regular doctors, and the nearest free clinic is across town. But without Dr. Rodriguez—" She trailed off, shaking her head helplessly. Martha watched as another family joined the waiting group outside, a mother carrying a fussy toddler. The need was clear, but the solution seemed just out of reach. Martha then sat at her desk, drumming her fingers against the worn wooden surface. The check Phil had given the NGO still lay in her drawer, a gesture of goodwill that had surprised her and given her hope. Her eyes drifted to her phone and a wild idea began to form, making her heart flutter with both excitement and apprehension. She picked up the receiver with trembling fingers, her heart beating faster as she dialed the number Phil had left her. The phone rang 3 times, each ring making her more nervous, before his familiar voice answered. "Dr. Barnes speaking." "Phil, this is Martha Young." She took a deep breath, clutching the receiver tighter. "I know this might seem strange, but we have a situation at the clinic, and I thought of you." "What kind of situation?" His tone was cautious but interested, with a hint of curiosity that encouraged her to continue. Martha explained about Dr. Rodriguez's emergency departure and the growing number of patients waiting for care. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, gaining confidence with each word. I know it's not what you're used to. The clinic mainly serves low-income families from the neighborhood, mostly black patients. And the salary? She paused, biting her lower lip. Well, it's nothing like what you made at the hospital. She could hear Phil's breathing on the other end of the line, the silence stretching between them like a delicate thread. The ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening as she waited. Finally, he spoke. You know, Martha, I've been doing a lot of thinking since yesterday at your house, about my prejudices, about the kind of person I want to be. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that touched her. And to be honest, I've got nothing but time on my hands right now. Martha sat up straighter, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing, her free hand gripping the edge of her desk. Are you saying? Yes, Phil replied, his voice firmer now. I'll do it. Maybe this is exactly what I need, a chance to face my biases head on, to really change. Not just talk about it, but prove it through actions. Martha felt a mix of relief and uncertainty wash over her, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you, Phil. I hope this works out. So do I will be there in an hour, he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of promise. An hour later, Phil stood at the entrance of the community clinic, his polished leather shoes a stark contrast to the weathered concrete beneath them. A long line of patients stretched around the corner and down the block, tired mothers bouncing fussy children on their hips, elderly folks leaning heavily on metal canes, and workers still wearing their dusty uniforms from morning shifts. Most of them were black, and Phil felt his chest tighten at the sight, his mouth going dry. Inside, the clinic was nothing like the pristine hospital he'd left behind. The walls desperately needed a fresh coat of paint, water stains marking the corners of the ceiling, and the waiting room chairs were mismatched and worn, their cushions flattened from years of use. The familiar antiseptic smell mixed with the mustiness of an aging building and the lingering scent of pine cleaner. Good morning, Dr. Barnes, Martha greeted him warmly, holding out a white coat that had seen better days, its edges slightly frayed. Ready for your first day? He nodded stiffly, slipping on the coat that felt rougher against his skin than his old one. His hands felt clammy as he picked up the first patient chart, the clipboard's metal clip barely holding the papers together. The name read Williams Tamika. Phil took a deep breath, trying to push down the discomfort rising in his throat like bitter medicine. As he called patients one by one, Phil maintained his professional demeanor, checking symptoms with practiced efficiency, writing prescriptions in his neat handwriting, giving instructions in clear, measured tones. But his movements were mechanical, his words clipped and formal, like a well-programmed robot going through its routines. When an elderly black man reached out to shake his hand in gratitude, Phil hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting, his fingers barely touching the weathered palm before pulling away. From her desk near the entrance, Martha watched him work, her dark eyes missing nothing. She noticed how he avoided eye contact with patients, how his shoulders remained tense throughout each consultation, as if carrying an invisible weight. Yet she also saw moments when his medical training took over, his genuine concern when examining a child's infected cut, his careful explanation of medication dosage to a confused grandmother whose hands shook as she held her prescription. You're doing fine, she whispered to herself, straightening papers on her desk, hoping that somewhere beneath his rigid exterior, real change was beginning to take root, like a stubborn seed pushing through hard soil. Phil worked through the morning, each patient interaction a small battle between his ingrained prejudices and his desire to prove himself worthy of this second chance. His responses were correct but distant, his care thorough but detached, like a man walking on ice afraid to put his full weight down. He was trying. Martha could see that clearly in the way he forced himself to stay focused. But the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. As the weeks passed by, Phil settled into a routine at the clinic. The familiar smell of disinfectant no longer seemed so foreign, and the creaky floorboards became as familiar as his own footsteps. Each morning he'd arrive early, reviewing patient files while sipping coffee from his thermos, the morning light filtering through the dusty windows. "Morning, Dr. Barnes," called Mrs. Johnson, one of the regular patients who came in for blood pressure checks. Her warm smile caught him off guard the first few times, but now he found himself returning it, albeit hesitantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. How's that new medication working for you?" he asked, surprising himself with the genuine concern in his voice. Martha noticed these small changes from her desk. She watched as Phil's rigid posture gradually softened, how his clinical detachment began to crack like old paint peeling away. During lunch breaks, she'd share stories about the community, and slowly Phil started to listen, really listen. "You know, Dr. Barnes," Martha said one afternoon, "Mr. Williams was telling me how grateful he was for the extra time you spent explaining his diabetes management." Phil nodded, remembering the elderly man's weathered face and determined eyes. "He reminded me of my father, actually. Same stubborn streak about following doctor's orders." The words surprised them both. It was the first time Phil had drawn a personal connection to any of his patients. As weeks passed, Phil found himself learning more than just medical histories. He learned about Ms. Thompson's 3 jobs to put her daughter through college, about Mr. Davis's garden where he grew vegetables for his neighbors, about little Tommy's dreams of becoming a doctor, just like Dr. Barnes. These stories began to chip away at the walls he'd built around his heart. The faces he once avoided meeting became familiar, welcome even. When young Marcus came in with a badly scraped knee, Phil didn't just treat the wound. He listened to the boy's excited explanation about the basketball game that caused it, even sharing tips from his own playing days. Martha observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. She saw how Phil's flinches became less frequent, how his smiles grew more genuine. During their morning check-ins, she noticed him asking about patients by name, remembering details about their lives that went beyond their medical charts. "You're different now," she mentioned one day, sorting through files. Phil paused, considering her words. "Maybe I'm just starting to see things clearly for the first time," he replied softly, his voice carrying a new warmth that hadn't been there before. Once, just like any other day at the NGO, the familiar rhythms of a busy afternoon unfolded around Phil. The waiting room buzzed with activity, children playing with worn toys in the corner, elderly patients chatting in hushed tones, and staff members weaving between chairs with clipboards in hand. The familiar sounds of phones ringing and the gentle hum of conversation created the typical weekday atmosphere he'd grown accustomed to. Martha was at her desk sorting through paperwork when the first wisps of smoke drifted through the air. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint burning smell that made a few people wrinkle their noses and look around in confusion. Then the acrid scent grew stronger, and someone shouted from the direction of the kitchen, where the break room microwave had been acting up all week. "Fire!" The cry cut through the quiet murmur of the waiting room, sending a ripple of panic through the crowd. The fire alarm's shrill screech filled the air moments later, its red light casting an eerie glow across frightened faces as people jumped to their feet, some clutching their belongings, others reaching for their loved ones. Phil's medical training kicked in. "Everyone stay calm," he called out, his voice steady and authoritative, drawing on years of handling emergency situations. "Form a line and head toward the exits. Walk, don't run." Martha quickly organized the staff, directing them to help elderly patients and those with mobility issues. She grabbed wheelchairs for those who needed them, her movements swift and purposeful. The smoke grew thicker, creating a hazy curtain across the room. People covered their mouths with their shirts and scarves as they hurried toward the doors, the sound of coughing echoing through the space. Outside, the spring air felt sharp and clean compared to the smoky interior. Phil watched as patients and staff gathered on the lawn across the street, some still catching their breath, others holding on to each other for support. The flames were now visible through the kitchen windows, orange tongues licking up the old wooden walls, growing more intense with each passing second. "Is everyone here?" Martha called out, trying to do a head count of the regular patients she knew, her clipboard clutched tightly in her trembling hands. That's when Phil heard it, a woman's desperate scream that made his blood run cold. "Tommy, my Tommy's still inside." A young mother was being held back by other patients, her arms reaching toward the building in desperation, tears streaming down her face as she fought against those restraining her. Phil scanned the crowd quickly, counting faces and matching them to his mental roster of mourning patients. His heart dropped when he realized the woman was right. The little boy who always wore Superman t-shirts and brightened up the clinic with his infectious laugh was nowhere to be seen. Looking up, he caught a glimpse of a small face in one of the second-floor windows, terror evident even from a distance, tiny hands pressing against the glass. Without thinking, Phil pulled off his white coat and wrapped it around his face, tightening it as securely as he could. The heat hit him like a wall as he ran back into the building, ignoring Martha's shouts behind him and the voices of others telling him to wait for the fire department. The smoke was thicker now, turning the familiar hallway into an alien landscape of shadows and shifting gray. He dropped to his knees, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke as he made his way to the stairs, using his memory of the building's layout to guide him. Each breath was a struggle, even through the makeshift mask. His eyes stung, tears streaming down his face as he climbed the stairs, the heat growing more intense with each step. The second floor was worse. The smoke was so dense he could barely see 3 feet ahead, and the crackle of flames seemed to be getting closer. He called out, "Tommy, Tommy, where are you?" His voice was hoarse from the smoke, but he kept calling. A small cough guided him to one of the examination rooms. There, huddled in the corner behind an examination table, was Tommy, his Superman shirt pulled up over his nose and mouth, his eyes wide with fear. Phil's heart clenched at the sight. This child's life was in his hands and nothing else mattered in that moment. All his years of medical training, all his preconceptions and biases, fell away in the face of this simple, urgent need to save a life. "I've got you, buddy," Phil said, scooping Tommy into his arms. The boy clung to him, his small body shaking with fear and coughs, his fingers digging into Phil's shoulders as if afraid to let go. He then brought the black boy outside, putting his own life at risk. Phil swayed slightly as 2 nurses helped him to his feet, his lungs still burning from the smoke. "That was incredible, Dr. Barnes," one of them exclaimed, steadying him with a gentle hand. His clothes were blackened and singed around the edges, and he could feel soot coating his face, but none of that mattered. Tommy's mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. Thank you," she sobbed, clutching his hand. "You saved my baby." Phil looked into her eyes and saw something that touched him deeply, pure, unconditional gratitude and relief. There was no trace of the barriers he had once perceived between them, just the universal love of a mother for her child. As he glanced around at the gathering crowd, Phil saw dozens of faces looking at him with admiration and respect. These were the same people he had treated with such coldness just weeks ago, the people he had allowed his prejudices to separate him from. Now they were reaching out to pat his shoulder, offering words of praise and thanks. An elderly man who frequently visited the clinic for his diabetes management stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "You're a true hero, doctor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A true hero doesn't see color when someone needs help." Standing there, surrounded by the community he had once held at arm's length, Phil felt something shift inside him. He realized that every person around him, every patient he had treated, every staff member he had worked with, was just as human, just as valuable, just as worthy of care and respect as anyone else. As the fire trucks pulled up and the crowd began to disperse, Phil stayed back, helping the clinic staff assess the damage. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, a clarity that cut through the chaos of the last few hours. When the last of the embers had been doused and the cleanup began, Martha approached him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You did good today, Phil," she said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You really made a difference." Phil glanced at the charred remains of the clinic's break room, then back to the faces of those still lingering outside, patients, neighbors, the people he had once kept at a distance. He managed a small, humble smile. "I just did what needed to be done, Martha. But maybe this time it was enough." She nodded, and for a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching as the last of the crowd trickled away into the twilight. Phil's heart swelled with a sense of belonging he hadn't known he needed. He looked at the clinic, damaged but still standing, much like himself. There was work to do, both in rebuilding the clinic and in rebuilding himself. "Go home, Phil. Get some rest," Martha urged gently, sensing the weariness settling into his bones. "Tomorrow's another day, and we'll get through it together." He nodded, turning to head toward his car, but with a final glance back at the clinic and the community that had become his new family. The next morning across town, Dr. Anthony Hopkins settled into his favorite chair at the breakfast table. He took a long, appreciative sip from his steaming mug, unfolding the paper with practiced ease, the familiar rustle of newsprint filling the quiet kitchen. His hand froze mid-turn when a familiar face caught his eye. There, on page 3, was Phil Barnes, his face smudged with soot, but wearing an expression Anthony had never seen before, one of genuine humility and compassion. The headline grabbed his attention immediately. "Local doctor becomes a hero at community clinic fire," the bold letters seeming to leap off the page. Anthony adjusted his reading glasses and leaned forward, scanning the article carefully, his breakfast bagel cooling forgotten on its plate. Each word painted a picture of courage and selflessness that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the Phil Barnes he had confronted in the hospital corridor months ago. That day, he had seen a man consumed by prejudice, someone who had betrayed his oath as a doctor with his biased treatment of patients. But this article told a different story, one that made Anthony's heart beat a little faster with hope. Dr. Philip Barnes, formerly of Memorial Hospital and now volunteering at the Community Health Initiative, risked his own life yesterday afternoon when he rushed into a burning building to save 8-year-old Tommy Williams. Anthony read the words again, his fingers tracing the lines, making sure he hadn't misunderstood. The coffee's steam curled up beside him, forgotten. A warm smile spread across his face as he continued reading about how Phil had disregarded his own safety to save the child, running back into the smoke-filled building without hesitation. The article mentioned how he had become a valued member of the community clinic, serving those who couldn't afford traditional medical care, treating everyone with equal dedication and respect. Anthony set down his coffee cup, his breakfast forgotten as he absorbed every detail. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that his difficult decision months ago had somehow contributed to this transformation. The man described in this article wasn't the same doctor he had fired. This was someone who had faced his prejudices head-on and emerged better for it. Someone who had found his true calling in serving others. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, his smile growing wider as morning light filled the kitchen. Pride swelled in his chest, not pride in himself, but pride in the human capacity for change, in Phil's journey from where he had been to where he was now. With a deep breath, he smoothed his tie and dialed Phil's number. The phone rang 3 times before Phil's familiar voice answered. "Hello? Phil, this is Dr. Anthony Hopkins." He paused briefly, gathering his thoughts, his free hand drumming lightly on his desk. "I just read about what you did at the clinic. Running into that burning building to save that boy. That was incredibly brave. Not many would have risked their own life like that." There was a moment of silence on the other end before Phil responded, his voice humble and slightly rough with emotion. "Dr. Hopkins, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Not after everything. Please, call me Anthony," he said warmly, leaning back in his chair. "Listen, Phil, I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh that day at the hospital. Seeing the person you've become, the work you're doing at the clinic, well, it makes me proud. In fact, I'd like to offer you your position back at Memorial. We could use someone with your dedication." Phil's response came after a thoughtful pause, the sound of distant clinic activity barely audible in the background. "I appreciate that, Anthony, really I do, but..." He took a deep breath. "I think I'll have to decline." Anthony's eyebrows raised in surprise, his grip tightening slightly on the receiver. "Oh?" "Working at the clinic, helping people who really need it, who might not get care otherwise. It's changed me. For the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be. I'm making a real difference here. These people have become like family to me." Anthony smiled, nodding to himself as pride swelled in his chest. "I understand, Phil, and I respect your decision. You found your calling." "Thank you," Phil replied, his voice sincere and steady. "And thank you for that day at the hospital. It was the wake-up call I needed. I'll never forget it." "Take care of yourself, Phil. Keep doing what you're doing. You're changing lives." "You too, Anthony. Goodbye." As Anthony set down the phone, he felt a sense of completion, a warmth spreading through his chest. Sometimes the hardest decisions could lead to the best outcomes, he reflected, watching the morning light dance across his desk. Phil's transformation was proof of that. Phil slipped his phone back into his pocket, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The morning sun filtered through the clinic's windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. He took a deep breath, letting his gaze wander around the familiar space that had become so much more than just a workplace. The scent of coffee and disinfectant mingled in the air, a combination he'd grown to associate with new beginnings. In one corner, an elderly woman sat with her grandchild, both offering him warm smiles as their eyes met. The little boy clutched a well-loved teddy bear, its fur matted from countless hugs. Near the reception desk, a young mother cradled her baby while chatting with one of the nurses, their quiet laughter creating a welcoming atmosphere. The walls, though faded, held children's drawings and thank you notes from grateful patients, each one telling a story of healing and hope. This place, he realized, had given him something his prestigious position at Memorial never could, a sense of genuine purpose. Each face he saw reminded him of how far he'd come from that day when Dr. Anthony had confronted him in the hospital hallway. The memory, once painful, now served as a reminder of his transformation. As he entered the main hallway, movement caught his eye. Martha stood in the doorway, her expression soft and knowing. She'd clearly overheard his conversation with Anthony. Their eyes met, and she smiled, giving him a proud nod that spoke volumes about their shared journey. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, reminding him of all the wisdom she'd shared with him over the months. Phil returned the nod, feeling a profound sense of belonging wash over him. This was home now, these people, this place, this mission. The simple truth of it filled his chest with warmth. He'd found his redemption not in grand gestures but in the daily acts of kindness and care that made up his new life. Each patient, each smile, each moment of connection was another thread in the tapestry of his transformation. If you enjoyed the story of Phil, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.